Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live, talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynn at pghcitypaper.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Hey, welcome. Happy Valentine's Day for those of you who cater to this particular holiday. I never have, even as a child. I think Susan and I talking about this once. I don't know what they did in your schools, but back in the 50s, man, it was a cruel holiday because kids would bring Valentines to school, which would be exchanged, and there was no thing like you had to bring one for everybody. And I just thought it was brutal. It was almost like a form of bullying. So I've never, and I ain't the sentimental type anyway, so anyway, but if you like it, if you like hearts and chocolate and being forced to be nice to somebody that otherwise you wouldn't be, go for it. Go for it. We shouldn't need a designated holiday to say I love you. I'm such a wet blanket, aren't I? Okay, so we have a guest coming in the second half of the show, and he's a history prof from Oxford, no less. So, I mean, he knows his stuff, and he's here to tell us about walls. Walls. Why is that hard to say? Walls in history. Why they were built, and did they work? And so we'll get a historical view on the absurd situation we now find ourselves in with our wall-obsessed president. Before that, though, I got to stay local with this Post-Gazette story. It says, let's put it this way. The Washington Post today had a pretty big story on it. I think it was the Post I read it in. I think so. Yeah, I don't think it was in the New York Times, but I think the Washington Post had a big story. This is such an embarrassment to, not to Pittsburgh, but to the Block family. And you gotta wonder what's going to end up happening here. Also, the union, the newspaper guild, has decided that since the ownership of the paper is really refusing to acknowledge the seriousness of what happened Saturday night, they have released eyewitness accounts that were written by 4 of the people who were in the newsroom when the publisher and editor-in-chief, J.R. Block, stumbled drunkenly in on Saturday night and terrorized people, and including his young daughter. So these eyewitness accounts really flesh it out, and unbelievable. So now this is all now national news. J.R. Block did not appear in the back at the Post-Gazette until late yesterday, when he was escorted back in with by his First Lieutenant Keith Burris, the guy who's taken over the editorial page. He has issued no apologies to his staff, said nothing about what happened. And I mentioned yesterday how the Washington Post is in a difficult position right now because another big salacious story involves their owner, Jeff Bezos, and his penis, for God's sake, and the National Enquirer, and how when the owner is the story, and the story is not necessarily flattering or something you want to cover because it's embarrassing, it's difficult for a paper. But the Post is doing it, and the New York Times specifically tipped their hat to how they're handling that situation. The same cannot be said, of course, for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which finally, I believe today, had a story. Maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was today, not sure. The story was this big. It was this big, and it said nothing. It really said nothing. It's the kind of thing you would read and say, what? And you would start asking a million questions, which of course the story should. And as far as there was no byline on that story. I'm sure no reporter would put a byline on it. So I can't imagine the chaos over there. But if I may, and assuming most of you, and I could be wrong, have not heard these first-person accounts, let me share them with you. There is also video, apparently, which has not been released. Although I think WTAE television had a snippet of something. But there is video. The Guild is handling this very well. They seem to have more concern about his daughter than he did. They don't want to embarrass her. So that's why we ain't seeing video, because there's a 12-year-old sobbing child, terrorized sobbing child involved. One of the women, I'll read this woman's account. She was a web editor who was there, Marianne Mazira, and I'll skip some of it, but she talks about how the evening of Saturday, February 8th, J.R. Block called in from downstairs because he couldn't open the door. Somebody went down to help him get in, and he came up with his daughter up to the 3rd floor. This is around 10 p.m. And then I'll read what she says. After Mr. Block stepped off the elevator and proceeded to walk briskly in a slightly stumbling, awkward manner through the newsroom, he was immediately yelling about various topics, pointing and waving his finger repeatedly up in the air and swinging his arms. He was very angry and irate. The entire newsroom could hear his voice. As he got closer, he walked straight to the Guild bulletin board and pointed to and touched the Guild Shame on the Blocks sign. It was clear he was intoxicated. He yelled at Tim to immediately call Sally Stapleton, which Tim did, and told Mr. Block she's on her way. He shouted that he wanted a picture of himself and his daughter taken in front of the Guild sign and demanded it run on the front page of tomorrow's paper. He fervently demanded the photo be taken now, right away, and forcefully grabbed his daughter's forearm, pulling her into the picture as she tried to pull away from him. She was crying, shaking, and pleading with her father that she did not want to be in a picture. She screamed, "Please, please, Daddy, no," multiple times. And multiple times he yanked on her arm, trying to pull her to his side so a photo could be taken. The photo editor on duty snapped a few pictures to placate Mr. Block as he continued to pull his sobbing daughter to his side. Through his threatening posture and verbally abusive tone, he appeared extremely annoyed, and he was growing angrier by the minute. In his heightened, agitated state, he continued to walk back and forth in front of the bulletin board and continued with his belligerent behavior. He did not and would not calm down. He repeatedly shouted out rude comments about various current and former managers, mocking them, saying they had gone to the dark side. The newsroom staff, what he called the working class, and his ex-wife, all of them, he bemoaned, he was screaming about, and bemoaned what he called a loss of millions of dollars on the part of the company. He yelled at his daughter right up in her face, "You're a block, don't you forget it. You're a block, you're not one of them," as he jabbed his finger into her shoulder. The woman who's writing this says, "I started to shake. Other members of the staff were rattled and didn't know what to do. During this time, I texted the Guild officer, Jonathan Silver, to let him know what was happening, and staffers working that night we felt threatened. and that he should get here as soon as possible. Mr. Block continued pacing back and forth as he railed against the newsroom staff, chastising them for the guild sign and shouting that he'll get rid of certain guild officers. He continued to shout numerous insults and offensive comments about the managers and staff at his daughter, naming various specific individuals. At some point, I stood up from my desk and, putting up my hand, told Mr. Block, "Stop. This has to stop." Yay, a woman stepped in. "Stop, this has to stop." He let go of his daughter, who he was holding firmly by the wrist as she was sobbing, and stepped away for a bit. I sat back down. A few minutes later, in an attempt to get his daughter away from this traumatizing scene, I got up again and approached him. I asked if it would be all right if I took his daughter to our cafeteria to get some water. He angrily asked me where exactly I was taking her. I said, "Just down the way to the cafeteria, and we'll be right back." He said, "Okay, go with her." As I walked away with his daughter, she was visibly shaking and crying. I got her some water, and we went back into the newsroom about 10 minutes later. I told her to sit wherever she'd like, pointing to areas away from her father, who was still standing at the guild sign. She asked if she could sit near me. I said, "Sure." She was crying during the entire time she and her father were in the newsroom. Anyway, and then her account, everybody, then other accounts come up, and they all essentially say the same. Here is their cops reporter, the police reporter, night reporter, Andrew Goldstein, who I have met, saying that his daughter was screaming that she didn't want to have the picture taken, crying hysterically, red-faced. I felt terrible about what I was watching. He ripped a cell phone out of his daughter's hand because he thought she was trying to call her mother. He was screaming in his daughter's face about the Block family legacy. "Do you want to be high class or low class? You're a Block. You're one of us. You have to learn how to lead." She was shaking and crying. Then he said I'm going to get rid of the bad guys, Jonathan Silver, Fuoco, and Shribman. I fired David Shribman. That's the former editor. I fired David Shribman. He continued to rant about Shribman. He said Shribman went to the dark side, and he complained about John Craig and how John Craig hated the Blocks. Oh, God. It goes on and on. At one point, somebody gets him into the conference room, and I think this is the human resources guy who came. And this Goldstein guy says, at one point I heard Steve yelling, "Don't touch me, don't touch me." And then JR said, "Then get out of my way," and barreled past him. Sally later told me that JR fired Steve about 50 times while they were in her office. Okay, so that's the scene. Another reporter says pretty much the same thing. Here's some additional information from a guy named Alex Miller. He said he'd lost $300 million on the newspaper, and then he said, "Do you know how much money $300 million is? No, of course you wouldn't." He yelled that the poster was all Shribman's fault. He said he'd fired Shribman for insubordination because he was disloyal. He said he should have never hired Shribman. He said the previous editor, John Craig, never should have been hired. He said no man is more hated by the Blocks than John Craig. He said he was going to fire Fuoco and Silver. He said he'd close the whole paper unless we took down the poster. I've been working in newsrooms for more than a decade, and this is the most bizarre thing. And believe me, in newsrooms you see bizarre things. This is the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. JR behaved in a way that would get any ordinary employee fired on the spot, escorted out of the building for everybody's safety. He was totally out of control. He was loud, violent, and it was frightening to witness. There was no way for anybody to know what he might do next. That's what's going on at one of America's great newspapers. That's what they call themselves up at the top. It's wow. Wow, wow, wow. We'll post this on our Facebook page. Do I send it to you, or do you know where it is, Amy? You can find it. It's at pghguild.com. It's from the Newspaper Guild. Okay. Unbelievable. I'm happy to give you an obit today. The reason being, this is a terrible thing to say. This was a bad man. Thank God he's not with us anymore. I mean it. I was afraid of him in my life because he was a frightening, for some people, charismatic leader who I saw as a fascist. And it always frightened me how many people fell for his crap. His name was Lyndon LaRouche, and he ran for the presidency of the United States 100 million times, I don't know. And he had an organization that was big enough that he always was able to get federal matching funds, so he got lots of money. One of his groups, he had a bunch of front groups that with great names that sounded like, oh, I should join that. One, the National Democratic Policy Committee. He received millions of dollars in taxpayer money for these presidential campaigns he waged. But more than that, his organization sponsored candidates at the local level. And I recall many times Lyndon LaRouche candidates winning. They won a lot in this state, by the way, in Pennsylvania. In 1980, Lyndon LaRouche outpolled Jerry Brown in the Democratic presidential primary. In 86, that was his big year, he fielded candidates all over the United States, and they got tons of votes. I mean, like 40% of the vote. And here were the states in which they showed the best: California, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. They got on school boards. They got on city councils. He developed alliances with a lot of farmers groups, with the Teamsters, with anti-abortion people, with the Nation of Islam, and the KKK. It was such a polyglot of craziness. He was always railing against the Eastern establishment. By the way, that's a dog whistle for Jews. He also thought Queen Elizabeth, for some reason, was out to kill him. He wrote many books and treatises that had huge circulation. He said that Jews created the Ku Klux Klan. He described Native Americans as, quote, lower beasts. In Illinois, two of LaRouche followers in, what year was that? 86. This was his big year in 86. Two of his people won the Democratic nominations for lieutenant governor and secretary of state in Illinois. So they were the Democratic candidates. They weren't Democrats. They were LaRouchians, but somehow they were on the Democratic ticket. They won. The guy who was running for governor on the Democratic side was the son of Adlai Stevenson, whose name was Adlai Stevenson Jr., or the third, I guess. And he said, I will not run with these two. So he didn't, but he still sort of ran as an independent, I believe. Anyway, what all of that did was elect a Republican governor. This guy, and the fact that so many people liked him, and in the course of doing talk radio, because I was doing talk radio in 1986, there were a number of people who listened to me who thought Lyndon LaRouche was the answer. He finally ended up in jail, as so many of these types do. The FBI got him on defrauding the Internal Revenue Service. He served quite a bit of time, I think about 8 years, in federal prison. But got out. Anyway, he died the other day, good riddance, age 96. In his last years, he was thrilled to see Donald Trump elected President of the United States. That's Lyndon effin' LaRouche. I thought he already was dead. I hadn't heard anything about him for some time. So, sometimes when you see an obit, you think, yes, I know. No, you certain people don't. I admit that I do. The world is a better place without him. Hey, the August Wilson Cultural Center is having a Valentine's Day special this weekend. It's a perfect one. It's Gregory Porter. Oh, yeah. This is soulful stuff. Yeah, bring your honey to see this 2-time Grammy Award winner, Gregory Porter. He'll be there Saturday evening. Tickets still available. Check him out. He combines soul and gospel and jazz, and it's wondrous. It's beautiful. And this is the guy who has recently released an album, Nat King Cole and Me. So Nat King Cole, see, that'd be a great guy to go to if you're in a romantic mood. And really, Gregory Porter, August Wilson Cultural Center, just one of the amazing nights that go on ad infinitum right over there down the street on Liberty Avenue. Okay, what else we got? I have, I'm not going to do it. Do I have time? I got 6 minutes. I feel like all I've been doing is reading to you. Do you mind if I read one more thing? We were talking about anti-Semitism the other day, which nobody wants to talk about. And believe me, woke Jews know that no one wants to hear us talk about it. So I do this again with knowing that a lot of you are thinking, oh, shit. But I read something that a woman wrote in The Nation, and I thought it was, I could have written it. When somebody says what you're saying, what you feel, what you're thinking. And so for those of you who are willing to hear, let me read it. Because anti-Semitism arrives in the news like a migraine, a premonition promising pain with a swift, thorough delivery on that promise. Again, this is a Jewish woman writing this. The flap over Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's dashed-off seeming tweets about a pro-Israel lobbying group has stretched on for days, each of which has lasted a century. Thus far, Republicans have chided Democrats for allowing a supposed anti-Semite in their midst. Democrats have capitulated somewhat, as is their wont. Leftist Jews have chided centrists and right-wing Jews who have chided them right back. Just about everyone has weighed in, from Chelsea Clinton to the president, who appeared unwanted but inevitably like piss in city snow. And in the Twitter mire and growing pile of think pieces, in the swirling intersection of prejudices of this particular mini scandal, clarity on what anti-Semitism is exactly and how to prevent it becomes less and less clear with every word. The primary feeling I have when anti-Semitism comes up in the news is exhaustion. It's almost preemptive. At the first mention of the word by a single pundit, all the strength leaves my bones. I want to drape myself on a divan and read the tender Jewish fiction of Joseph Roth for the next 20 years. Time and again, I've watched disputes over anti-Semitism whirl up and come to nothing, leaving only acrimony in their wake. The prospect of engaging with these discussions winds up being little more than daunting. This is not to downplay the importance of anti-Semitism. As a world historical phenomenon, it's remarkably durable. As a political tool, it retains the weight of a lead bludgeon. The way it has surged back into prominence in recent years is impressive and unavoidable if you're a Jew. The notion of eradicating it, like eradicating any hatred, is impossible. And it has recently led to a massacre in Pittsburgh, so the stakes are high and the wound freshly scabbed. But fighting anti-Semitism is like boxing a hydra. The scholar Deborah Lipstadt defines anti-Semitism as, in essence, a conspiracy theory. This makes it a very different sort of prejudice than mere disdain or closing one's country club to Jews. Anti-Semitism is a world view, more or less detailed depending on the dedication of the anti-Semite. Distilled to its essence, it's a postulation of nefarious transnational control by Jews of institutions inspired by malevolence and cunning unique to only Jews as a people. That is precisely the thesis brought forward in the Henry Ford financed book, The International Jew, published almost 100 years ago. It's repetitious, but its thesis arrives early on in an essay titled The Jewish Question, Fact or Fancy. And here's some of what it says. The world-controlling Jew has riches, but he also has something much more powerful than that. The international Jew, as already defined, rules not because he is rich, but because in a most marked degree he possesses the commercial and masterful genius of his race and avails himself of a racial loyalty, the like of which exists in no other human group. Those are Henry Ford's words. The notion of the Jew as a puppet master is at the core of anti-Semitism and has little to do with individual Jews and everything to do with who you believe controls the world. Anti-Semitism must be a comforting theory. It's been called the socialism of fools, a reductive theory that rages about economic equality by placing blame for all disparities at the feet of the Jew. Thus, vitriol is neatly directed at a set of individuals while the system continues to function as it always has. And perhaps it is soothing to think that the world, instead of a lewd and ghastly welter of chaos, is actually being driven according to a distinct plan, even if it is a villainous one. Believing that the defeat of the Jew would mean the defeat of evil is an optimistic thought. It means you believe that evil can vanish. Anti-Semitism also retains another classic feature of conspiracy theory, It is immune to fact. And in an age in which new conspiracies take root so readily, in which anti-vaccination conspiracies have led to measles-ridden towns, in which an anonymous poster on 8chan can rally thousands behind the cryptic claims of QAnon, what chance does the oldest conspiracy theory of all have of vanishing? Anti-Semitism is a central tenet of the white supremacist worldview. In the eyes of racists, organized efforts to attain racial parity cannot be created by those deemed intellectually inferior by virtue of their race. And so the cunning Jew is inserted as a catalyst. Prior generations of white nationalists believed that the NAACP was funded completely by Jews. Robert Bowers, the shooter at Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, has a similar motivation, believing Jews were responsible for promoting racial mixing. But it was modernized slightly by the idea that Jews are the eminence grise that drives immigration into the United States. Bowers was obsessed with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. The members of the Republican Party that so smugly mouth pieties about anti-Semitism today were perfectly happy to play along with a midterm strategy that posited that George Soros, a Jew, was the creator and financier of migrant caravans north. I'm not going to have time to do this all, but let me just cut to our last chapter. Discussing anti-Semitism can be maddening, at times even counterproductive. Trying to box a hydra can drain the limbs of strength, and yet this oldest of conspiracy theories has led to millions of deaths, 11 in Pittsburgh this year. It's led to terror plots, to assassinations, to threats, and to desecration of our graves. It must be discussed, because allowing anti-Semitism to fester in darkness, poorly understood and winkingly insinuated, is to allow it to flourish unchecked, and when it does, it poisons all it touches. That is much of it, part of it. But I think keep that in your head when she says, quoting Lipstadt, anti-Semitism is different than other racism because it's a conspiracy theory. It's hugely international in scope. It's a conspiracy theory and an easy way to save the world. Eradicate the Jew. That's different than normal racism. Think of it that way and understand it has always been something that is a marvelous tool for those who want to divide like-minded people. And it's being used now, and we're just seeing the beginnings of it, in an effort to divide progressives from each other, liberals from each other, Semites from each other, Americans from each other. And to discount it is to be an idiot. You have to know history. Speaking of history, let's bring in our historian. I'm sorry, Joe. Come on in. Dr. Buzzkill, Professor, Hair Professor. Hair Professor Dr. Oops, it goes down. There's nothing you can do. Hair Professor Dr. Buzzkill.
Let's hope
you know,
that's not
someday we got to have you in on this.
Oh, Lordy, yeah.
Yeah, anti-Semitism.
Just
just never stops. And why it's so enduring. And this is a fascinating piece that it says it's different because, unlike just hatred of somebody because of skin color or religion, it's a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, about the worldwide Jewish, as if they're. And it's long-standing.
It's endless.
It's been going since the 18th century.
Right. It's endless.
So the conspiracy theorists, that is.
Well, like the protocols of the elders.
Well,
of
yeah,
Zion,
it's just
coming, right? Just beyond belief.
As crazy as everything else we're talking about.
Yeah. So speaking of crazy, so this is Professor Buzzkill, and I'm looking for your okay. Here's your basic. I just want to get you your. He is also known in polite company as Joseph Kuhil.
Right. But
Kuhil?
Yeah, I try not to use that name because I get so much hate mail for Professor Buzzkill that I'm afraid of being chased down the street.
What do you mean you get hate? Oh, because
people love their history myths and they want to cling to them, and then when I bust them, they...
Okay, so this is a myth buster. This is a conspiracy theory buster. This is somebody who actually traffics in fact.
I traffic in fact.
Well, aren't you out of step with the times?
I am totally out of step with the times, but there's big money in trafficking in fact. I'm absolutely rolling in it. Our podcast is doing great because people are hungry for shows like your show, shows like my show.
So tell people how to get your podcast before we get into all your stuff.
They can get it on all their favorite podcast apps. They can get it at ProfessorBuzzkill.com. We're very fortunate we're here in Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh is one of the podcast centers of the universe, center of the podcast universe. Libsyn is here, the big distributor, and my media folks, Sidekick Media, help us push the word out. So this is one of the best places to be. So ProfessorBuzzkill.com, and that's where you get all the Twitter stuff and all the other connection things.
Okay, so you were a history professor
back in the 20th century. Yeah.
Did you get? You were at Oxford.
When in the 20th. That's against another 20th century phenomenon. Yeah.
And you wait a minute though. So are you an American or what? Because you went to the University of Melbourne for your master's, and then you go to London. I mean Oxford for your doctorate or something. And so how'd you? What? The U.S. wasn't good enough for you?
Well, no, I am U.S. In fact, I was born in Toledo. Right. I'm a Midwesterner, and I went to college in California, and then I got a couple scholarships. A scholarship to go to Melbourne for my master's degree, and then I got a scholarship to go to Oxford. And I was specializing in British and European history, so it seemed like
that's
a good
nice place to be. Yeah, it'd be a very good place to be.
Yeah.
So we thought we'd get a historical perspective on one of our president's favorite subjects. And that would be walls. Big, beautiful walls.
Right.
Yeah.
And, we've had them forever in history. They're a major part of civilization, but the development of civilization, but they don't necessarily always do what people say they're going to do, and they don't necessarily always work. And so I kept putting it off, but I finally just got sick to death of hearing that, walls work, walls solve all these problems. And so we did a show. We have a show this week about border walls in history. Why were they built, and did they work? And the answer is they were built for complicated reasons, and they didn't always work. So
it's funny. I just had this image pop into my head. I was in St. Andrews in Scotland a few years ago, and I was at some old wreck of a castle, and someone was explaining to me how people had holed up in the castle, to be safe, and how these guys came in, I forget who, from the North Sea, and stood outside the castle. I mean, how the hell are we going to get in here? And of course, they went under. and that was the first time, and I remember somebody said they undermined.
That's right. That's where that word comes from.
That's where that word comes from.
Right.
And it's duh. Yeah. They went under, and I was able to go in and crawl in some of the...
Oh, really?
Yeah, in some of the places that they had...
St. Andrews is beautiful, and it was a walled town and a walled the church. But you're right. I mean, ancient walls. We talk on the show all the way back to Sumer and the Great Wall of China. They've all been undermined in that way. Anytime there's a superior force, whether it's smarter or more technologically advanced, they can defeat any concrete brick wall. So to think that we're going to have a border wall that's going to solve all our immigration, migration, drug problems all in one go is just ridiculous.
But you do know that Trump doesn't really give a damn about the wall, and
that's my suspicion.
It's a means to an end, which is not a wall, but getting
to satisfy the people who think that
a wall is a good idea. And you're never going to reach them because those are people who believe everything Donald Trump says. So
well, that's what's so unfortunate, and that's why I think it's so important to talk about these things, because it only takes 5 minutes of reading, or maybe even 3 minutes of reading.
That's more than the president has done all week.
But you're right. It's not so much the president that is a problem. It's the people. It's the people out there. And, you've got to think these things through. Sure, fences make good neighbors, but if your neighbor is determined to get into your yard, your neighbor's going to get into your yard. It just
and even Ring doorbell ain't going to save you.
That's right. And as soon as cannons were invented back, in the 13th, 14th century, brick and mortar concrete walls.
Is that what did them in?
Well,
because they could be taken down with one boom.
And also, as I said on our show, our immigration problem is mostly about people overstaying their visas. And how did they overstay their tourist visas? They flew here in an airplane over what would be the Trump wall.
They flew here legally.
Legally, yeah. So
and then they stayed too long.
We're talking about solving a problem with the wrong solution. So.
And here's where my head just starts exploding. Yes, and you're talking reasonably and rationally, and you know that's not. It's just maddening. Okay, so
that's the saddest thing about the last 5 years of our country is that people don't bother.
Facts don't matter.
Facts don't matter. People don't bother even to take just a few minutes to check things out.
But speaking of facts, history.
Yeah.
Is rife with fake news.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Right,
that's why we're able to do our show. Yeah.
Yeah, history is. Well, who said it? I mean, it's written by the winners.
Written by the winners, yeah.
Yeah.
Do
we know who said it?
That's a good question. It may be Teddy Roosevelt and it may be Mark Twain. That's another thing we do on our show. We bust myths about quotes. And that one is sort of unknown, whoever first came up with that. But that's certainly true. People who accomplish whatever they want to accomplish then go back and write about what they
They get to write what they did. Right.
On the other hand, human groups are notorious in being lazy and not paying attention, and all sorts of other evidence eventually creeps out. Archaeological evidence, for instance, in ancient times, we know a lot about the enemies of the Romans because of the archaeological evidence left behind. Often the Romans would complain about, oh no, there's these groups attacking us. So there's a lot of evidence out there that just people haven't taken the time to look at. And thank goodness there are people like me and other professional historians who do that. And we try to tell everyone, but I'm afraid it's not getting very far.
No. I have to tell you, when I went off to college myself, way back in the 60s, I spent the first semester essentially learning that most of what I had learned in grade school and high school was a pack of lies. What is that?
Well,
or it just wasn't the full story, or whatever it was.
I don't want. Sometimes there's a very famous book called "Lies My Teacher Told Me."
Yeah.
And it's about different misunderstandings of American history, and I don't like to use the word lies in that context because I think that the people most of the time, our teachers were telling what they were given. And what they were given when we were young was the great American story of this kind of progress in these kinds of ways, and skipped over or certainly treated with kid gloves uncomfortable issues like slavery and things like that. And so it's not, again, it's the kind of the fault of I always take it back, the fault of the populace. We needed then and we need now to say, no, wait a minute, my own personal life, my own family life is more complicated than that. So how could it be that it's Ben Franklin, this, then this, and this, and then suddenly we're going to the moon?
How come?
Think about your own life. Your own life is all full of warps and weaves and different things going on. I can imagine a country's history is infinitely more complex. So that's why a simple story is almost always too
always
simple.
Wrong. If it fits on a bumper sticker, other than the one that says "shit happens," it can't be true. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the first wall that we, with our meager knowledge, think of historically? The first, wall that's known that was built like Trump's wall.
Well, almost all of them were built for defensive purposes, not
exactly like Trump's.
Yeah. Well, he claims.
Well, isn't that there are hordes of women and children coming?
But it's not true. The Sumerians, way back in what is now Iraq, built a wall to try to keep out invading nomad groups, and the Greeks built walls. The Athenians built walls to try to help defeat the Spartans. But it almost always was an extremely military.
It was military
fortification. It was not intended to keep out immigrants or migrants or trade or anything like that. And all the way up to Hadrian's Wall in the Roman Empire. These are all the ancient sort of famous walls. They were all built.
Hadrian's Wall was in
northern England. Right. It's very, very far north of England. When it was built, it was the northern limit of the Roman Empire.
And it was to keep the witch hordes out
there.
there.
Picts and other native Celts out. But it was also to help regulate trade. It was also to help have places for barter and bringing in natural resources. Walls are a lot more sophisticated and flexible and useful than just walling ourselves in and hiding from everybody. That's why the Berlin Wall was so famously weak and ineffective, is because it only had one thing to do:
wall people in.
Wall people in, and it was totally totally against the grain. So and ever since then, the Great Wall of China, right, Great Walls in Constantinople, all these things have almost always initially been military only, especially against small raiding groups, and were never intended to keep out migration, either inflow or outflow, and eventually they're breached.
The thing about the Great Wall of China, I could never figure, how long is that damn thing? It's like thousands and thousands. How could it even be policed?
Well,
so
that's it, yeah.
Who would even know if somebody had breached the wall?
It was part. Well, some of it was in the imperial period. Some of it was a big job scheme. You had to put a lot of people to work building it, and then a lot of people manning it, so to speak. But there were a lot of different walls. First of all, it's not just one. There were lots of them.
How long did that take to build?
Oh,
hundreds of years?
Oh yeah, it starts in BC, is not really finished. The walls that we tend to think of now are 14th century, 1300s and 1400s in the 20th century. So we're talking about 1,000 years. But they're different walls at different times. They built almost all in the north, but they built them sometimes out of emergency for emergency reasons. They're under attack. And then eventually, over time, as the Chinese Empire gets strong, they're able to make the walls very, very permanent and very, very long. But that's only because the empire is strong and the outlying areas, their outlying enemies, are weak.
Right.
It's not like you can suddenly put up a wall against, I don't know, the invading Russians' hordes. If the invading Russian hordes are as powerful as you are, you're in trouble.
Yeah, they're going to come through, or over, or under, or something. They're coming.
Yeah, so it served the same purpose as almost all the other walls have, except for the Berlin Wall, which is the weird sort of exception.
That can't be the only one that was built to keep people in.
Maybe not. Well, first of all, every city in the ancient world and early modern world had a wall.
Yeah.
Keep people in, keep people out. Protect churches, to protect universities even. Right. So there was all those things. But the Berlin Wall is really strange because it's a 20th century and built to keep people in at a time when, everybody had given up on the physical wall as an idea of protection. I mean, the Atlantic Wall in World War II was ships. It wasn't. Right. It wasn't a physical wall. The Cold War walls that we had and the Soviets had were airplanes, not brick and mortar walls. So to throw up a wall in '61 in Berlin was as crazy as talking about putting up a wall now.
But in some ways, wasn't it? It was also psychological.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's a form of sort of terrorizing their population.
Right, absolutely, terrorizing their own people. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a sliver of the fact that when travel between East Berlin and West Berlin was easier, lots of West Berliners would go to East Berlin because the products were cheaper. Right. They get more or less the same thing at East Berlin prices, communist prices, and bring them back. And so that got a little bit old, but mainly it was for propaganda purposes and to try to keep people from fleeing to the West. And of course, it worked in a way, but a lot of people died. And, it was a very, 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 very shameful stain on both the East German government and the Soviet government. The propaganda hay that the West made out of the Berlin Wall.
That's what I was going to say.
Amazing.
I mean, it was a gift
absolutely
to the West.
Practically an own goal. It's just it was crazy. And really, when you think about it, although it seems to last a long time in our lifetimes, it didn't last that long.
No,
28 years or something. The Great Wall of China stands for thousands. But that's I think when you hear wall, you think permanent. You think now we've got the solution. This is going to work, and it's going to work forever. But it never has.
It's human nature, though, is it not, Professor? To think, just as a child thinks, that if I get behind this thing, I'm safe.
Yeah.
I mean, humans must have all. I mean, and in some ways, it buys you time.
Yes, absolutely.
We'll build a wall. We'll build a moat.
Mm-hmm.
And these are barriers.
Yeah, people should go to the Buzzkill bookshelf again, ProfessorBuzzkill.com, because our book on the Buzzkill bookshelf this week is Professor David Fry's book called Walls, a history of civilization in blood and brick, and that's what he talks about. The early walls especially keep out raiding nomads and allow for the development of civilization, sophisticated trade, sophisticated commerce.
Yeah.
But again, they don't last forever, and if the culture that builds them starts to weaken, then the walls weaken. So, but you're right. There's something in the human psyche that says to us, our strategic air command is not a real wall. But the wall around my backyard is a real wall and keeps my dangerous neighbors out. Where in truth, the strategic air command is as close to a real 21st wall. Century wall as we're ever going to get. Yeah.
But here's the thing. Here's what I keep seeing in this crazy time. Human nature is, we're still I keep saying we're cavemen with smartphones. You right? You can talk, you academic, till you're blue in the face, but people feel obviously millions of people feel protected by a wall. Mm-hmm. Trump wouldn't have this as his battle cry if it wasn't. It just doesn't, it resonates, right?
Yeah, but we should be smart enough to just take a little pause and think about it. Yes, my backyard wall does prevent my neighbor's dog from coming in and terrorizing me, but that's about it. We should be more grown up than that. Once civilization gets to a certain point and we have nuclear weapons, we need to think of how else to protect ourselves, how else to solve our problems. It's kind of maybe it's natural, maybe it's in our DNA, but it is kind of childish to talk about walling ourselves off in the 21st century.
It's not even kind of childish.
I should say. Yeah. This is modern media. It's very childish.
It's totally It's so stupid. I can't believe it. Have humans throughout history, though, always had the need to delineate borders?
Yeah, and that's one. And that's one of the most important reasons why walls get built. A lot of tax purposes. The Romans, for instance, built Hadrian's Wall partly to protect against native Celts in the north, but also to tell the people in the north of Britain, look, we're protecting you from those savages.
Pay us.
Pay up. Yeah, and that goes right through human history. Cities, especially old cities in Europe, build walls as part of their sort of civic responsibility, but also as a way to raise revenue and keep themselves protected. So what we tried to talk about on this show, on our show Tuesday, was something that seems as simple as a wall is so incredibly complicated, both the reasons behind it, how they work, and how they work in different contexts or don't work in different contexts. It's never as simple. The word wall only has 4 letters, but the meaning behind wall or walls is infinite.
You know what I was thinking is, we're and you're a professor of European history, but I was thinking, I'm not aware of as many like walls in South America or in Africa. Do you think?
Not Africa so much, although some of the bigger mosques in Eastern Africa are very impressive, and some in West Africa too, Northwest Africa. But the ancient Incans and the Aztecs had huge walled cities.
They did.
Oh yeah. But
not the Native Americans in what is North America, though.
No.
And they didn't even have a concept of ownership of land. Or is that a myth?
That's probably a myth, but I want to say something that should be said a lot more by even people who claim to be experts like me. I don't know enough about that. And that's a good thing for you. You Lynn Cullenites out there should go look up the Native American concept of land ownership, because the last time I read about it was 30 years ago.
Well, if there were all these tribes, they had to have a sense of their territory, right?
And there actually are negotiations negotiations, but there are certainly discussions between settlers and the government and Native American tribes. It always ends up being one way, the power flow. But yeah, there's definitely a concept of land. It's not as if there's a sort of difference in the Native American mind that doesn't think of borders or ownership of territory. No, that's certainly not true.
A defensive wall that I saw and was shocked when I saw it because it didn't look like I thought it would. I was on a bus traveling, but I was in Israel. And all of a sudden, somebody said, I'd been sort of noticing this nice little village and stuff, up on a hill. but there was a wall that looks sort of like the kind of walls that are built up now alongside highways where there are
noise reduction walls. Yeah,
that's what it looked like.
yeah.
And somebody said, "That's the wall."
That's the.
And I said, "That's the wall."
Yeah.
It wasn't. I don't know. It wasn't what I expected at all. I later encountered it, and it didn't look like that at all. The wall was different in various places, and the wall had lots of ingress and egress areas to it. But that wall, when it was built because to protect the Israeli citizenry from
car bombs and
from people coming in with bombs, and they were killing a lot of.
Oh yeah,
It was a effort to control the influx of people.
Dangerous people.
But of course, it ends up complicating. It ends up being a PR nightmare for that country.
It's a city against a civilization against itself, and it worked, but in almost exactly the same ways as the Great Wall of China and a lot of these ancient walls were designed to protect against sort of one-off raids and nomadic raids. The Israeli wall is so that cars can't be driven in with bombs in them and explode. It was an attempt. The Israeli wall is not an attempt to stop migration of Palestinians.
No, people come in and out.
Yeah.
And that same trip, I'm going from Israel into Jordan, and I see a whole bunch of people going the other way into Israel, and I said, "Who are they?" And those were Jordanians coming into Israel to work back and forth and back and forth and back and forth.
And the Israelis the Israeli government wouldn't want to stop that because they need
Nor would the
workers.
Jordanian government because they want their people to have those jobs. They were at construction jobs in Israel.
That's why we like to say on the show, it's just so complicated. A wall seems so simple.
And it's never.
And it seems to mean X, but it's not simple, and it means X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E.
Yeah. Jeez. People should travel more, don't you think?
Well, there's that, yeah. There is that. But if we wall them off, they're not going to be able to travel.
There's a place right around here named Wall.
A town?
Yeah.
Or neighborhood?
Wall. Where the hell is that?
Wall, Pennsylvania?
Wall. Just like, Pennsylvania, when I moved here, I was so blown away by the place names because,
Some of them
are, like
Uniontown.
Yeah. Moon.
Township.
You can go to the moon. You can go to Wall. Wall is around here. Where is it, Amy? It's near Wilmerding.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Which is another favorite place of mine. I live in Wall. Who knows why that would be?
I imagine there's some person named Henry Wall back in the 18th century.
That's what I'm thinking, that it would be.
Probably not a wall. But the fact that we have a little town called Pitcairn is fascinating because, after all, that's an island, in the Pacific. So, we name things for all sorts of reasons. Verona, in Pennsylvania.
North Versailles.
North Versailles. We have all these different names from outside. So, I hope there are at least two gentlemen in Verona. That's a Shakespearean reference for all you buzzkillers out there.
Yeah. And for my audience, who certainly know that, right? So, again, Professor, thank you very much. But tell people, he does a podcast once a week. Yep. And tell them again they can get to you.
iTunes, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get all the standard podcast places, Spotify, and of course ProfessorBuzzkill.com, our homepage and our sort of walled-in home website.
What's up next for your next podcast? Do you know
Our
yet?
next podcast, we're going to talk about another contemporary political subject, which is why is the word socialist in the official name of the Nazi Party?
Yeah, which has caused a lot of confusion.
Yeah. And so that's what we're gonna fix all that next week. Whether whether it penetrates Ann Coulter's skull is another, or no, not Ann Coulter, Laura Ingraham. She's worse about that one subject. Is another story.
Oh God. Hey, thank you for. I think of you a little bit like the Man of La Mancha. People attempting to educate people these days.
Well,
it's bit like tilting at windmills, it seems.
We like to do it. Maybe they will have a musical about me one day.
Okay. Professor Buzzkill, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice. We'll have you back again.
Thank you.
That'd be nice. Thank you all, and I'll be back tomorrow because I got nowhere else to go. See ya.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.